thank you all for coming to this very special event. We're extremely pleased and honored to welcome Dr. Carol Ward to give us a talk on her most current research. Carol, well, I've known Carol since we were both kids, basically. I was a postdoc at Johns Hopkins. Carol was a graduate student at Johns Hopkins, so she's just a little bit slightly younger than me. Carol got her degree at the University of Michigan, where she worked under Milford Walpole, a very, very famous, well-known paleoanthropologist. She moved to Johns Hopkins, and she worked with Alan Walker, who was also my supervisor when I was a postdoc. He was also Mary Silcox's supervisor when she was a grad student, and no, not a grad student, but as a postdoc. But she was at Johns Hopkins as well. So there's this this web of intrigue and interconnections that link us all. Carol, since she graduated, she's asking me to reveal any dates. Since she's graduated from Hopkins, she has been at the University of Missouri, starting out in the Anthropology department and then moving to the medical school, where she is director of anatomical sciences there. And for many, many years, Carol has been doing things that very, very few people do, because she works on fossil apes from 20 to 10 million years ago, which is the kind of thing that I do. But she works on limb bones and things like that. But she also works on the more recent ancestors of humans, and she does both the postcranial anatomy, in other words, the limb bones, and especially, as she's going to talk about today, the torso and the vertebral column, the backbone, the chest. But she also works on jaws and teeth, and it's quite rare. It's really a rare species of paleoanthropologist who works on all of these different kinds of things. Not just widespread in time, but also different parts of the body. So she's really a very special researcher, and we're very happy to have her here. So I just want to remind you that after the talk, roughly around 8 o'clock or so, there'll be a reception, and there's a cash bar out in front, and we hope that all of you will be able to stay and interact with Carol and ask her questions until about 9 o'clock or so. So without further ado, let me invite all of you to welcome with a lot of enthusiasm, Carol Ward.
Thank you, Dave, for that nice introduction, and thank you for not mentioning how long we've actually known each other. We can just keep that between ourselves. I'm really thrilled to be here. Thank you guys for coming out in the middle of a weeknight to hear me share something about what I'm researching, and I hope by the end of tonight to give you guys maybe a new way to think about human evolution and our origins. You know, we're always finding fossils, we're always learning new things, and as scientists, it begins to change and modify our ideas about how we evolved. And I'm hoping to show you guys a little bit of some of the new fossils that are available, things that aren't even published yet, so you're getting an inside scoop on some of it, and maybe change a little bit of your ideas about where we all came from. Everybody probably recognizes this. This is Lucy. She's sort of the poster child for human evolution. She's an individual is a species called Australopithecus, which means southern ape, afarensis, from the Afar region of Ethiopia. And Lucy is our poster child for human evolution because she's a pretty complete skeleton. We don't often get skeletons this complete in the fossil record. She's an adult. She has all of her wisdom teeth in. Her growth plates are fused on her bones. She's about 3.5 feet tall. But she is in most ways very clearly like us in important ways, and we know that she's our ancestor. And so she's what we think of when we think about human evolution. There are lots and lots of other fossils, but we always talk about Lucy. And studying Lucy is studying the beginning of a story. And every good story starts at the beginning. And if we want to understand the story of human evolution, we need to figure out where we came from. We need to figure out what initially set our ancestors off from our ape forebears. What made us different from all of the other apes that lived in the past? And so studying Lucy and her relatives can tell us something about that. But it's not just important to know about Lucy and her origins. Natural selection, the process that shaped humans throughout our evolutionary history, can only act on last year's model. If we want to understand how we got to point B, like this skeleton, which is a member of our genus Homo, we need to understand what point A was. What was that starting point? Because then we can see what were the changes, the magnitude and direction of changes that led to ourselves. So studying our origin tells us something about where we came from originally, and then something about how we developed to the species that we are today. I'm going to talk about shapes. I'm not going to read to you from Dr. Seuss, unfortunately, which would be much more entertaining. I'm going to talk about body shape, because body shape is something that doesn't get a lot of play. People think about teeth, and they think about diet, and they think about limbs, and they think about locomotion, and they think about hands, and they think about using stone tools when we're thinking about our evolution. But I'm going to talk about our body shape, because body shape is something that actually tells us a lot about the biology of our ancestors. So I'm afraid, subject you guys to some new fossils, but you're going to get some science, you're going to get a lot of anatomy, and I hope from the end of it you'll learn a little bit about us, our evolution, and maybe something about how we as scientists and as paleoanthropologists come up with all of the stuff that we say. Who has not ever seen this picture? Everybody's seen this picture. It's an iconic view of human evolution. It makes a pretty good t-shirt. Everybody probably has a t-shirt like this, has it on their cubicle walls or something. It's something that we see everywhere in our culture, we think of, and it's sort of our iconic view of what human evolution was like. So we start at the beginning, and we see this hunched over ape-like creature that slowly, through Lucy's species and other Australopithecus, hunched over, stands upright, and finally makes it to fully standing upright, and we are like this today. And this is a great picture, it's a great view, and I think it's what the public generally thinks of as how human evolution went. And I think actually as scientists, we always have this in the back of our mind as well. But is it really accurate? Is this really how we evolved? That's what I want to talk about tonight. When that picture was drawn in the early 1970s, the fossil record for human evolution looked something like this. There was Australopithecus early on, Homo erectus in the middle, and then eventually Neanderthals and humans and other things later. The fossil record is a lot more like this, and I didn't even put all the pictures up here. We have hundreds and thousands of fossils of different hominid ancestors. There may have been 8 or 15 different species of our ancestors that live in the past. And so what we're understanding is there's not this linear change, but it's a bushy tree. There's lots of different experiments in being different kinds of hominids. But throughout this, we can say something more biologically real about our ancestors. And I'm not going to talk about all of this tonight, but it's to give you an idea that there's a lot more out there than led to that time-life drawing. And I said I'm going to talk about shapes because shapes are really important. This is a gorilla and a human, and you can look at their skeletons without being an anatomist. You can tell they're different shapes. The gorilla has those long arms, long fingers, short legs. Humans have these nice long legs. We've got a long waist here, little arms. Gorillas have this big pelvis and this stocky middle as a shape of their body. And this is really different. And if we evolved from something like a gorilla, we changed a lot. And we're going to talk about that tonight. But maybe we did, maybe we didn't. Why are gorillas shaped the way they are? Well, gorillas and other great apes move about the world, mostly in the trees, or often in the trees. And when they're in the trees, they're really big. So what they do is they hang below the branches. And they move around trees by moving below the branches, rather than trying to balance, teeter on top of them. And this has shaped their anatomy in a lot of key ways. So they hang below the branches like this, and they're so specialized with these huge long arms, big long fingers, and a very thick torso shape right here in the middle. They can't even bend their waist. When they move on the ground, they tend to walk on all fours, on their knuckles. And that's reflected in their body shape. Humans don't. We, of course, we walk around on 2 feet. We have long limbs, which is very efficient and effective for walking around. We have a waist we can move when we walk, and it's shaped our anatomy. So if we can say something about the body shape of our ancestors, maybe we'll know how we got up and moved around. Because that's one of the first things that we see in the earliest human ancestors, is walking upright on 2 feet. That's one of the first major changes that we made in our origins. Now, this is the same picture you just saw. We just took the arms and legs off here. This happens to be a chimpanzee this time and a human. And you compare the body shapes here, and they're rather different. You know, you see that cone-shaped rib cage. There's really no waist here at all. The pelvis is very long and very stiff, and that's not like humans. What about Lucy? If Lucy was shaped like us, perhaps she moved like us. If she was shaped like a chimp, perhaps she didn't, and she was hunched over. If you open any textbook of human evolution, this is what you're going to see that Lucy's body shape looked like. You're going to see this big triangle-shaped rib cage, a nice short human-like pelvis, inexplicably not much of a waist. I don't know why that's the case. But this is our idea of what Lucy looked like. And this idea, this is something that was really came up with about 1980, is our idea that maybe she wasn't moving around like us because she has this big, stocky, barrel-shaped rib cage. This is another reconstruction of Lucy. And if you sort of connect the dots with your eyes and imagine what she'd look like if you put skin and hair and flesh and things on, you might imagine a body shape something like this gorilla. You'd connect the dots here, and you see the rib cage would come out. There would be a big belly, not much of a waist. Why do we care? Why does it really matter? Because we infer a lot about biology from the torso. We might ask, did Lucy have a waist? So what if she had a waist? Well, when we walk, we move our waist. It helps keep us walk very efficiently. A chimpanzee or gorilla can't do that because they have no waist. They can't move. And so that would mean that they moved very differently from the way we move. Did she move her hips when she walked, or did she walk like a chimpanzee? Was she shaped like an ape? Was she shaped like us? And what does this mean for our origins? It's even more important than moving around, because you imagine if she had this big belly here, maybe she had a large gut. Maybe she's adapted to eating low-quality food that wouldn't give enough energy to run a large brain, and the changes to humans involve shrinking the gut to grow our brains. There's a lot of biological inferences we make from this peculiar body shape. But is it really correct? Well, Lucy's not the only skeleton we have out there. We have a number of other skeletons of Australopithecus, and there are multiple different species, like I mentioned. We've got Lucy here. We now have a big male afarensis skeleton called Katanumu, and even a baby called Salam. We have some skeletons from South Africa, another new species from South Africa, and all of these have parts of the torso, of the shape. So it's one thing to say something about the limbs, but if the body shape doesn't support your locomotor reconstruction, you're not doing yourself a very good job interpreting things correctly. So we can look at all these bits and pieces and try to say something about body shape. But they're not all the parts there. The torso has been a hard thing to study and a part of the body that nobody works on, because there are all these little bones and they're all stuck together in you and me. But when you go in the fossil record or you go to a museum, they're just a bunch of bones in a drawer. So we have to get a little bit clever and creative in the way that we look at the bones to see how the whole body's put together. One thing we can do is we can look at the vertebral column, our spine. And the spine in an ape, this is a chimpanzee here, this would be the same in your dog or your cat or your horse, or pick your favorite animal, is the vertebrae really designed to work as a nice series of arched bricks, and it distributes the weights very evenly across a nice spine when you're walking on all fours. Well, we don't walk on all fours, we stand upright. And we could walk around with our body hunched forward like the chimpanzee. You can try it if you like, and then see how sore your back is the next day. It's not very efficient, it's not very comfortable. What humans have done is we put a series of curves in our spine that allow us to get our weight up over our limbs, up over our center of gravity, so we can stand and walk very efficiently. So curves in the spine are a key component for being to stand upright rather than walking all hunched over. And when we look at the fossils, we can see this is Lucy, reconstruction of Lucy's vertebral column. And when you stack up the vertebrae, it's like a series of wedge-shaped blocks. You get a curve. These are two South African fossils. And in all of them, you can see the kind of curves we see in you and me. So why do we think she hunched over? I don't know. Well, here's something important. When we look, we're paleontologists, we look at fossils and we say, Lucy was built this way so she could stand upright. And she had to be built this way, she should stand upright. And we tend to think of features of an animal and what they're good for. But natural selection partly cares about what you're good for. It also partly cares if you're not built well enough to do the things you need to do, you're going to be selected against. If you can't get your food, if you can't find a mate, if you can't process food, if you can't do the things you need to do to survive and have surviving offspring, you'll be selected out. So we began to think about these spinal curvatures and the way things are built, and how could we tell if they're there, and how could we tell perhaps why they're there. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of a detailed story here to sort of illustrate sometimes how this works. So when we have this series of curvatures in a human spine, what happens is in your lower back, and you probably all know this acutely, maybe even today, because it causes a pain, you have this curvature in it's a backwards bend in your lower back, right? And that's what causes back pain, right? But what happens is all the back parts of the vertebrae, when you put this backwards curve, it's called a lordosis. When you put a lordosis in your spine, all the back parts of your vertebrae are pushed together. They have to become close together in order to achieve that posture. So what if we could see something in those individual vertebrae of our Australopithecus to see if they had a curvature? Well, we can. What you can do is you look at the back of the vertebra. So you're looking from behind somebody, your tailbone is down here, and this is the bottom vertebrae. And you can see all these joints between the vertebrae. Here comes the anatomy part. These are called facet joints, and they get wider and wider and wider as you go down. Apes don't do that. Facet joints, bam, straight all the way down. Australopithecus, the facet joints get wider. What this does is it lets, when they get wider and wider, they can slide past each other when they're all being squished together in a lordosis, so you can stand upright. And we can see this in Australopithecus, so we know that they had a lordosis. They had spinal curvatures. Okay, that's all well and good. But what about why this has to be there? And we began to think about this, and we came up with the idea that is sort of illustrated by this. And it looks a little scary, bear with me, but you'll understand in a moment. So this is the tailbone down here. It's your sacrum, back of your pelvis. And this is your last vertebra, and this is the one above it. And what happens is these are the facet joints. And these two facet joints here, they actually come together. And your vertebrae have a ring that surrounds the spinal cord. And the spinal cord is going through the middle of the vertebrae, and all the nerves are coming out. And if you pinch a nerve, it causes pain and weakness and serious clinical problems for people, okay? What happens is, if these facet joints are lined up on top of each other, they bang into that ring of the vertebra in between at the same place. And bone is a dynamic tissue. You push or pull on bone, and it grows, it expands, it grows, it shrinks, it does something. And what happens when you push on that ring in the same place is you eventually wear all the way through, and it fractures, which is what this is supposed to indicate here. And this is a condition, it's a mouthful, called spondylolysis. Spondylolysis is found in about 20% of people. Probably a couple of you out there have it. But I'll tell you what, you probably don't know you have it because most people it's not a problem. I'm going somewhere with this, I promise. Who gets spondylolysis? It tends to be gymnasts who are adolescent who do things like these. Gymnasts, butterfly swimmers, people who put a lot of extra lordosis in their lower back. Extra extension, so they're squishing those facet joints right there on their neural arches of their vertebrae really hard when they're growing, and their bones are growing very fast, and they tend to get spondylolysis. Well, what can happen is if the back part of the vertebra is then no longer connected to the front part of the vertebra, is it can slip out. So take a look at this picture. This is a CT scan reconstruction of a young woman. She was a volleyball player, college-age student. And this is her last vertebra in purple here. And on this side, her facet joints are lined right up on top of each other, and they've eaten away completely through this neural arch. And you can see this vertebra is beginning to slip out of alignment. She had to have surgery right away because she was in terrible shape. Fortunately, she was asymmetrical. So when we look at the other side of her, here her facet joints are offset, and she's been able to keep some bone. So what we realized is that Australopithecus, Lucy, had these increasing facets so they could achieve a lordosis without getting spondylolysis. So it helped us understand why Lucy was built the way she was. But we also thought, wait a minute, could we use this in some way to improve the modern human condition? Can we think about this? So what we did is we measured a bunch of bones, we measured a bunch of x-rays in the clinic, and you can see that people, normal people, have this nice increasing facet joint. People who get spondylolysis don't have as much of an increase. And we're scientists, so we got nerded out, and we measured it, we did statistics, and we published it a bunch of different places. And it turns out that you're predisposed to getting spondylolysis if you're not built with these increasing facets. So that's what would have selected for that in Lucy, and that's what happens to people today. And now it's beginning to be used clinically as an indication of whether someone could be treated conservatively or with surgery, as an indication for problems of other people's back pain and so forth. And we found all this from studying Lucy. How cool is that? So we learned something about why Lucy's built the way she is and why we're built the way we are, and it can also be used to understand why things go wrong with people today. So it's kind of a nice story about how studying human evolution tells us something about ourselves today. All right, don't read the details of that, it's too scary. But back to Lucy a little bit. So Lucy, this particular skeleton doesn't have any lumbar vertebrae, but Australopithecus certainly had those lumbar curve. It certainly could stand all the way upright. But what about the shape of the rib cage? Did it have the big pot belly like we saw the reconstruction? Well, what we can do is, again, we can get clever and get nerdy with our anatomy and look at things a little bit more closely. So this is a bird's eye view of a vertebra here and some ribs. So this is your back. This is the spinous process, little bumps you feel going up and down your spine. So the belly would be up to the ceiling and your back is down here. And what you see in humans, the rib cage, the ribs curve way around before they head forward. So it's almost like our whole vertebral column is pushed into the rib cage. What does this do? Well, we stand upright. So it means all the muscles that are attaching back here have a lot of leverage and efficiency for holding us in upright posture. We don't see this in a chimpanzee. The ribs just shoot out to the side and they head on forward because they're not holding their bodies upright all the time. Well, we never find ribs stuck to vertebrae in the fossil record, unfortunately. But what we do find is vertebrae. And you can see here, this part of the vertebra, it's called a transverse process where the rib attaches. In a human, it's also swinging backwards. In an ape, it's sticking out to the side. Aha, we can measure that. And we have vertebrae. Here's a vertebra from Lucy. Here's another one from Lucy's species. And we can measure the position of these things. And we can measure them, we can plot them out. And we can measure this angle, and you can see humans have the vertebrae swinging backwards more than modern apes do, and here's all our Australopithecus way down here, showing that they too had that vertebral column invaginated or pushed into the thoracic column, which helped them stand fully upright, not hunched over. Okay, so that's telling us we're more fully upright. Got spinal curves, we got this. Rib cage is shaped more human-like, but what about that triangle shape? This is Kadanumu. He's the large male, he's about 5 feet tall, male Australopithecus afarensis of Lucy's species, 3.5 million years old. And the cool thing about him is he has some pretty complete ribs, including complete second rib, which I know doesn't sound very exciting to you people, but it's very exciting to me. And here's why. The discoverers were able to measure how curved that rib is, and they did it this way, it doesn't matter. And they made a graph like this showing that humans and Kadanumu here have very tight curvature and apes have more straight. Okay, well, maybe Kadanumu looks like us because there's not a knuckle walker. Chimps and gorillas are knuckle walkers, so maybe this has to do with knuckle walking. Maybe it means that they weren't climbing in the trees because all the upper limb muscles attaching to the ribs and the upper part of the body. Maybe it means they're not climbing in trees. You can't tell. So I had an undergraduate, a very good undergraduate, who went and she measured more things. We took pictures of ribs and she did all this measuring stuff and she worked very hard for a year and she put more species in our graph. These are other apes. These are gibbons and siamangs, the hand over hand swinging small apes that live in Asia. These are orangutans. And you see orangutans look like African apes, but orangutans don't knuckle walk. So this doesn't say anything about knuckle walking. Gibbons swing through the trees by their arms at high speed. So this doesn't have anything to say about climbing. But what gibbons and humans and Kadanumu have is very curved upper ribs because they have that broad upper rib cage shape, because they're orthograde. They hold their bodies upright all the time. So it's another piece of evidence that it's not about locomotion in terms of rib cage shape, it's about posture and being upright. So where does this all get us? Well, this is a picture that was published a number of years ago in Science magazine by some of our colleagues, and this is a chimpanzee, and this is a human, and this is our idea of what Lucy would look like. And you can see she sort of looks like a chimp with longer legs. She's got this big pot belly and no neck for some reason. I don't get that. So I couldn't stand it, so I got Photoshop out, and I improved Lucy with Photoshop. And this is my new and improved Lucy. What did I do to Lucy? Well, first of all, I gave her a more human-shaped rib cage because all of the evidence I've showed you and more suggested she really had a human-like rib cage. I gave her a waist because she had just as many lumbar lower back vertebrae as we do, so she would have had a waist. And when you do this, she looks a lot more like a stocky person than she does like an ape on 2 feet. And that's a really different way of looking at her. And I also couldn't stand it. He didn't put any arches in the feet. And we have fossils now to show there are arches in their feet. So she certainly had arches in her feet like we do. So this Lucy is a very different Lucy from our old ideas of what Lucy was like. So let's bring it back to this. And I'm sorry for all of you people who spent $20 on every t-shirt you had parodying this. It has to go. It's not gonna be right. Australopithecus wasn't these hunched over halfway humans in terms of walking around. They were walking around just like we do. And if you saw them, they would be holding their bodies upright and moving about just about like we do. They're different in other ways. They're not as smart. They had different jaws and teeth and so forth. But in terms of how they moved, it was very much like us. Which lends you to wonder with this life diagram, if these guys were so modern, what about what came before us? Is this really the best model for what our ancestors might have been like? And that's what I want to continue to talk about now. So it makes sense to think that our ancestors looked a lot like a chimpanzee. If you look at all the animals out there today, all the apes out there today, they're all pretty similar except for this one, right? They hang below branches, they've got long arms and long curved fingers, and they move about the trees the same way. So it's perfectly parsimonious or simplest to assume that all the ancestors on the lower parts of the trees would have looked very similar. Makes sense. It makes sense except for one thing, and I'll talk about that. So these animals, again, when they come down to the ground, they're so adapted for being in the trees, they tend to walk on all fours, at least the great apes do. And we know that we came from something that was like a monkey, just walked on all fours on top of the branches. At some point, it evolved this hanging below branch adaptation, and at some point, we got to the point where even when they're on the ground, they tend to walk on all fours, on their knuckles. So how did this all happen? Did it happen at once? In which case, that is where Lucy came from, or maybe not. Well, that's when we get to the Planet of the Apes. And I put the slide in even before I knew. You all need to get Dave Begun's book that's coming out, Planet of the Apes, because it's going to tell you about all this stuff, and much more eloquently than I can. I've read it. It's actually very good. You should get it. But we have the Planet of the Apes. So before Lucy, before Australopithecus, from about 20 or so million years to about 5 or 6 million years ago, there were hundreds of great ape species that lived all over Africa and Asia and Europe. And there are big ones and small ones, all kinds of them. What we have today is a small relic population, disappearing quickly, of apes to choose from. So maybe the modern apes that we have today are not representative of all the apes that have ever lived. And if that's the case, maybe our ideas about what the ape ancestor that gave rise to humans and chimps and gorillas and so forth might have been like. So we go back to our picture here. What do we know about the fossil apes? Well, thankfully, I'm not going to tell you about all of them because there are an awful lot of them. But if you go back in time to near the beginning of our family tree of apes and humans, there's an animal like this one. This is called, it used to be called proconsul. That's about to change, I guess. I call it proconsul still. This is an ape. We have almost every body part from young and old individuals who know a lot about it. And all these things walked above branches like a monkey. They didn't have tails, so we know they're apes, because you know apes don't have tails, right? So Curious George is not a little monkey? Yeah? Okay. We know they're apes. They walked on all fours. Nothing like these suspensory animals we have today. And it's not just proconsul. We have a whole bunch of different animals, most of which were similar. There might be one or two different ones. That's fine. So we know we came from this sort of quadrupedal ancestor. So the earliest apes weren't a lot like modern ones in terms of the way they moved about the world. We also know that once we get to 6 million or 7 million years ago to more recent, we have early hominids, and these all seem to be pretty much like us, bipedal more or less. Oversimplifying for the anthro majors out there. But what about in the middle? We got a lot more animals in the middle. And for all of you phylogeny nerds out there and so forth, we don't exactly know where all they fit in. There's a whole lot of them. I've oversimplified this. But we have a lot of fossil apes, and what I can tell you is none of them looks exactly like modern apes in terms of their postcranial anatomy and the way they moved about the world. Some of them have some similarities here and there, but none of them looks exactly modern. And if they're not exactly modern, maybe the things that these modern animals shared evolved on this lineage, and maybe even separately on these lineages too. In which case, what does that mean for the ancestor? It might mean that they looked a little bit different from the way we thought. We know, for example, this animal, Australopithecus it's called, is very closely related to orangutans, and it didn't move anything like a modern ape. It was all fours as well, not suspensory. So we know orangutans evolved this separately. Gibbons and siamangs must have evolved this separately. So it makes us wonder about our ancestry as we get closer and closer. And there's an animal that's particularly important that I'm going to talk quite a bit about called Rudopithecus. Rudopithecus was found by Dave Begun and his colleague Laszlo Kordos in Hungary, a site called Rudabanya, which many of you here have heard about. And it's about 10 million years old. And the best part about it is it has a pelvis. Pelvises are really rare in the fossil record, but they found this one. It's a beautiful pelvis shown in different views here from the left side, and we have some pieces from the right side as well. And this is one of the most important fossils that we've discovered in ape evolutionary history, I would argue, because it can tell us so much about the evolution of this positional behavior, how animals move around. So the pelvis is important because it makes part of the torso, part of the body and body shape. And that body shape is related to locomotion, which varies from animals that walk at 2 feet on the ground, hang below branches, have prehensile tails, walk on all fours in the trees or the ground. Primates and anthropoid primates are really variable, and body shape reflects these different locomotor adaptations, so it's important. It also anchors the muscles that move the lower limb. It makes part of the hip joint. It also houses all the viscera. It makes the birth canal. It's a really important bone in terms of learning about the biology of our fossils. And it tells us something about our shape story that we're talking about tonight. So the fossil, as you saw, is missing some parts. Unfortunately, the fossil record gives us broken fossils sometime. So a lot of what I'm going to show you are laser scan images. These are 3D images you can capture with a laser scanner. You can put them together and you can make these digital models. And the digital models are really handy, especially when you have incomplete fossils, because we can use the sort of CAD software that's developed for things like the auto industry to measure fossils in new ways that we couldn't before. So a lot of what I'll show you shows you some of this. So one of the things we're able to do, this was my former graduate student Ashley Hammond's work, she's able to take digital models of the hip bone and then of the thigh bone, of the femur, and she's able to put them together in the computer and see what the range of motion was like. So a monkey is walking on all fours. It moves his limbs about like your cat or dog does. It's got a very narrow body, and the orange is sort of its neutral position, and the purple's about as far out as it can get its leg when it moves around, which is fine, because it's moving its legs underneath it. An ape, on the other hand, if you're hanging below branches and need to get from one branch to the other, using all of your limbs, and you're reaching your legs in all different postures all around to get to the other branches on the other side of the tree. And so apes have much more greater range of motion, and they can abduct or move their limbs in a much greater range of motion. And she was able to do this for Vertebrae. And sure enough, it also has a greater range of motion like we see in an ape, supporting the idea that indeed this is another animal that's suspensory. And there are other upper limb bones and so forth that are suggesting a suspensory lifestyle for Vertebrae as well. And Australopithecus is somehow pretty closely related to the African ape and human group. So that's an important point. Oh, so maybe this suspension does evolve here. That's all good. We can also look at the hip joint and the distribution of bone within the hip joint. Now, joints are covered with articular cartilage, and cartilage is slick and helps the joints move, but cartilage has no vasculature. So if you damage the cartilage in your knees, you can't regrow it unless you now have a clever orthopedic surgeon. But in general, if your joints are damaged, you can't regrow cartilage, that's it. You're not going to move around, you're not going to do very well. There's a lot of selection pressure on joints in order to have enough surface area to distribute the load across your joint surface. So if we look at the hip joint, we can see this is where the hip joint is here. And you can see animals that walk on all fours have about the same amount of joint surface everywhere because they're loading their limbs in lots of different positions as they're moving quadrupedally. Animals that hold their bodies in an upright position, like chimps, humans, Australopithecus, the top part of their joint surface is much larger, right? It's expanded. And this is the same for Australopithecus here. It's a little broken up in places, but you can still measure this really nicely. And I'm a scientist, I can't help it. You can measure it and you can show that that's in fact different. So that tells us also that it's suspensory and Australopithecus is holding its body upright, like apes and humans. Okay, it's an ape story. Now, if you have another bird's eye view of a rib cage here, this red arrow is indicating the shoulder joint. Monkeys are walking on all fours, so their shoulder joints face the ground. Apes are moving their limbs out to the side, so the shoulder joints face to the side. And this is associated with a very wide rib cage as opposed to a narrow rib cage in monkeys. And this is true. These are CT scan reconstructions of actual animals, and you can see the wider rib cage in the ape and the narrow rib cage in the monkey. All right? Well, I should go back actually for a moment. So when the rib cage is wider, the pelvis has to be wider too because it's next to the rib cage and it's got muscles running up and down from one bone to the other. So we should be able to see if this, I keep going back here, if this pelvis here is wide out to the side like the ape as opposed to narrow like the monkey, maybe we can say something about the body shape. Okay, what we can do for Australopithecus is we can actually use this CAD software to trace the edge of the hip joint and fit a plane to it so we can see how it's oriented. And we can do the same thing for this upper part of the pelvis called the ilium, and we can put a plane through that, and then we can measure the angle. So we can see if that pelvis is rotated around to the side like the ape or if it's narrow like the monkey. And we can measure it and we can plot it out. The details are unimportant, but these are all apes and humans up here with this rotated pelvis to match a wide rib cage, and here's Rudopithecus. Here are monkeys down here. Here's that early proconsul, very narrow pelvis, not rotated at all. So this is looking suspensory. We're upright, we're suspensory, we have a mobile hip joint. It's all looking pretty apey. We can't measure how wide the upper part of the pelvis is because it's missing, but what we can do is we can fit circles to the front and the back edge of it, and a smaller circle is more curved, right? And we can plot those out too, and look at the amount of curvature you see in Ruda. It's like the apes over here. It's not like these long straight pelvises of monkeys. These are two measurements of the same thing. So very flaring pelvis. It's getting very wide at the top, which would match perhaps a wide lower rib cage. So that's looking apey too. Now here's the last difference between apes and monkeys. Monkeys have a long, flexible lower back, and they can bend their back, and they do that when they move around the trees. Apes are absolutely stiff, and the rib cage meets that big, wide pelvis. And that gives a really stiff platform for all those muscles that are anchoring the upper limbs come all the way down to the pelvis in an ape. And they don't have to use muscular energy to keep their vertebral column from moving too much and squishing the spinal nerves and the spinal cord inside of it. So they have a very stiff torso. And in real life, it looks the same thing. You see a monkey here, it's rounding his back to get a drink of water. The gorilla can't do it at all. And it's all about climbing. You stiffen up that back to climb. And so apes have these really long pelvis, and they've gotten rid of most of their lower back vertebrae, their lumbar vertebrae. Well, we can measure pelvic length in Rudopithecus. In this case, between where the spine attaches here, the sacroiliac joint and hip joint, you can measure a difference, and you can plot it out here. And here's great apes, they're really long pelvises. Here's monkeys with their short pelvises. Here's gibbons and siamangs with longish pelvises, and wait a minute. Rudopithecus does not look like a great ape. I just told you all these ways it was a great ape, but it's in a long pelvis. And if you don't have a long pelvis, you probably still have a longer spine. And if you have a longer spine, what you can do, you can move that lower back. So it may have had 5 back vertebrae in its lower back like we do, rather than just 3 or 4 like an ape. So even though it had rearranged its torso for being able to move around the trees, it was holding its body upright, it was suspensory at these mobile hips, it hadn't become so specialized like a great ape that it stiffened up that whole body. And remember, body matters, right? Shape matters. So this is what maybe it looks like. Here's a monkey. These are just the hip bones. And this is what a monkey long, skinny torso would look like, as opposed to a great ape with that long, flaring pelvis. And these are gibbons and siamangs. They're hanging in the trees, hand over hand brachiation. And they have a fairly wide pelvis here, but they've got a lot more flexibility here. Looks a lot more like us. And if you take Rudopithecus and you do a cheap Photoshop trick, you can also do this with fancy CAD software, it actually matches a siamang pretty well in terms of the shape of its pelvis. So this is an ape, it's a lesser ape. It's not quite as specialized in terms of its torso as a bigger ape. And so this is what its whole body might have looked like. And so perhaps this might be a good model for what a Rudopithecus torso would look like. And if you paid attention early on, this looks a lot more like a human torso than the chimpanzee does. So just as a thought experiment, here we know we have these above branch quadrupeds early in the Miocene. A lot of these middle Miocene apes are still doing that kind of thing. And it's not until later that we start to see Rudopithecus and some other apes that also lived in Europe at that time that may have been more generalized. These are various artist pictures of what they think they might have been like, holding their bodies upright, moving and hanging around in the trees. But they weren't built quite as specialized as modern great apes are. They were also smaller than modern great apes. Modern great apes are really, really big, and they're very specialized. This is a picture of orangutans moving around in the trees. You see the hips are pretty flexible, they move around the trees, but they're very, very specialized for these extremely flexible movements. Chimps and gorillas are the only ones really that don't straighten up their hips all the way when they move around. But chimps and gorillas, unlike orangutans, spend a lot of their time on the ground. Orangutans live up in the top of the trees. Unless people deforest their forests and eat too much candy with palm oil in it, they never have to come down to the ground at all. So they're up in the trees and they're very flexible. Chimps and gorillas, though, they live in Africa, and a lot of the time, and they're big, they spend a lot of their time on the ground. But they have these huge upper limbs and strong hands and that really stiff torso so that they can anchor their muscles and move in the trees. So when they come down to the ground, they spend a lot of their time on all fours. They become somewhat specialized for knuckle walking, walking on their knuckles and moving around so that when they stand upright, they can't really even do this. So what we're left with today, back from the planet of the apes until now, is really the most extreme apes that have lived in some ways in terms of climbing adaptation. So maybe they're not the best models for what our ancestors would have looked like, and we should dip back in time and take a look at some of these Miocene apes. Still arboreal and suspensory, but a lot more generalized. So imagine, if you will, that this is an ancestral condition, just as a thought experiment, right? The hypothesis that our ancestors are slightly more generalized than we see in chimps or gorillas or orangutans, our living great apes. We need to remember, too, that chimps and humans have been evolving for just as long as each other, maybe 7 or 8 million years separately. We've changed, they may have changed too, and it may be that given the fact that in the Miocene we have animals that are, so many animals that are built so differently, that maybe our ancestors wouldn't have been just like a chimpanzee, and chimpanzees specialized for this hanging in the trees knuckle walking, and we didn't. It's a hypothesis. Not everyone agrees with me necessarily, but I think the evidence from the torso is beginning to suggest this more and more and more. And of course, it's walking up right on 2 feet that eventually paves the way for all of the other things that humans end up doing later on, like making and using tools, getting big brains, and evolving into the uniquely unique species that we are today. So if you went back in time, rather than seeing that time-life view of Australopithecus, maybe what you'd see is these animals walking around like this. And you imagine these ancestors, say Rudopithecus is our hypothesis anyway. They're upright in the trees and they're moving around in the trees. At the end of the Miocene, the climate is cooling, global climate is cooling. In East Africa, forests are shrinking and receding. There's a lot more open areas. And these animals that had been spending all their time in the trees in the Miocene are beginning to spend more time on the ground. And they're moving on the ground just like they're moving in the trees. And they have a little bit more flexibility in their back so they can stand upright much more easily than a modern great ape does. So maybe the question we should be asking about our origins is not the age-old question of why do we stand upright on all fours. Maybe the best question, given the new evidence from the fossils, from Australopithecus and from the fossil apes, is why did we never drop down on all fours to begin with? Maybe it's only chimps and gorillas that did that separately. We don't know this for sure, but I think some of these new fossil evidence from sort of both sides of the story are beginning to suggest that that's at least a new way to ask a question. And that's a really different thing, different way of looking about human evolution. Because if you're asking the wrong questions, you can't get the right answers for how our lineage evolved. You have to ask the right questions. That's always the hardest part of science. So I think these fossils are suggesting that we should really be thinking of these new questions, at least approaching the fossil record with these new questions in mind. And that's the kind of thing that we're doing. And so what do we need to do to test some of this? Well, we need fossils that are in between, even earlier than Australopithecus. We need to know something about the very earliest Australopithecus is like, and so forth. And just as a cheap plug, because I can't stand it, this is what we're doing. We're actually at an earlier, my Western kind of paleo project. I'm co-director with a couple of other colleagues, and we're going out in Africa, like a lot of other teams, trying to find new fossils. Lots of people are doing lots of great field work in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, and finding these new fossils like we are. You can follow our project if you like. I can't help it. We're at the very, very earliest Australopithecus site, which is almost over a million years older than Lucy, to see if we can find evidence to see if they were really as fully upright as Lucy is. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of postcranial bones yet, but I'm sure we will soon. And so it's going to be new fossils that we're going to get to test some of these ideas, in addition to looking at the comparative anatomy of our ancestors. So I will end there, and I hope I've given you maybe a new way to think about human evolution when you see people's new fossils that come up in the popular press and so forth. And I just want to say thanks for all you guys for spending your time. I'm happy to answer questions, and there we go.
I'd like to open the floor to questions, but before that, I just want to say that this is a great example of how science is supposed to work. In paleoanthropology, we as paleoanthropologists are often depicted as being capable of eating our own young. And Carol and I disagree on some fundamental issues. I don't think that humans did not come from all fours and come up. I think we evolved from all. Carol does not. We are best of friends. We respect each other's points of view. We are happy to agree to disagree, and we debate and we discuss. And, over time, we'll probably reach a consensus and our ideas will probably merge. But for now, we've agreed to disagree, but we each respect each other's point of view. So I just wanted to mention that because that's not often the image, the sense that you get about how this field works. And it's not always like that. There are definitely conflicts among people, just like in any science. But this is a nice example of two good friends, two colleagues who respect each other, but who disagree on a couple of things. We agree on many, many things, but we disagree on this one thing that's actually kind of central to each of our approaches to the fossil record.
You can be friends with people who are wrong.
And yet Carol is coming to dinner at my house tomorrow. And I'm not going to poison her.
Yeah, so I hope he doesn't short sheet my bed tonight or something.
So anyway, are there questions? I don't think that this is long enough to move the microphone up to people. No. So you'll just have to emote if you want to ask.
Or you can yell and I can repeat the question if I can hear it too. Because I love questions. It's great. Dave's exactly right. That's the wonderful thing about science and fossils is you have these ideas. We don't have a smoking gun for any of these things, one way or the other, which gives us great fodder so we can drink beer and talk about fossils together, which is perhaps one of the most fun things a person can do. But if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. It may happen. So probably, most things, it's going to be somewhere in between, I'm sure. Yeah, Mary.
So you seem to agree with the Australopithecus people that we're not looking at a chimpanzee type model, that they would have us coming from a different type of quadruped. Could you just speak a little bit to that?
Absolutely. She asked, there's an ape called Australopithecus, known from the species Australopithecus ramidus. This is 4.4 million years old. It was announced a few years ago. And this is an ape that's thought to be more closely related to Australopithecus in humans than it is to chimps, so in the hominin branch of the family tree. And this animal doesn't look particularly chimpy in the body parts that I'm talking about. In some ways it does. It has long curved fingers, and I've oversimplified the picture. It's not like nothing about ancestors would have looked like a chimp, but just the parts that I'm talking about today. And the describers of this feel that it's sufficiently different from something like a chimpanzee in terms of the shape of the pelvis in particular, and what it might say about the lower spine and its posture, that they are hypothesizing that the ancestor was not very much like a chimp also. So I think that actually supports the kind of model I have here in a way. They also interpreted, based on the fact that it had flexible wrists, that it walked on all fours on the trees, and some other things that I don't agree with, because I think it really does have some sort of bipedal traits, the way the head would have fit on the spine, and the way the pelvis is shaped, and so forth. So I can buy that. But it has a big old grasping big toe, and so forth. It's a weird animal, so throw everyone for a loop. But I think that's another piece of evidence that the ancestor wasn't maybe as chimpy in all ways as we had thought. The authors of those papers were, I think, more surprised by that than anyone. I remember having literally yelling arguments with those guys 20 years about how important the Miocene was. We really need to understand what these Miocene apes look like. That's ridiculous. And now they're all looking at the Miocene. And yeah, and then they're not going to be chimpy like chimpanzees in all ways, certainly. Whether I've got the complete picture perfect, I'm sure I do. But yeah. Maybe I don't. But it's changing times.
Yes, up there.
Oh.
Yeah?
Hi, I'm not a paleoanthropologist, so this might be a bit of a naive question. You talked a lot about the torso and the ribcage. It was really fascinating. But one of the things that seemed really prominent to me, which you didn't talk about, was the neck.
The neck.
And the spine.
Yes.
Stress over there, which is obviously where a lot of muscles go in to hold the head up
Yes.
when they're walking. And that will give you some reasoning.
Yes. What does the neck look like? Because clearly, since we hold our head up on top of our vertebral columns, the neck, we have a backwards lordosis in our neck vertebrae too. We hold our heads upright. And actually, the one thing that we really don't know much about Australopithecus is the neck, in fact. Partly because we haven't had many vertebrae from the neck. We have one or two from the site that Lucy's found hotter. We have almost every body part. We have young and old individuals. We know a lot about them, but not very much about the neck. There are a couple of new fossils at Salam and baby Australopithecus from a site called Dakika. Actually has the first complete vertebral column from the head all the way down to the bottom of the rib cage. It's a baby. and it's all mashed together, so we had to take the fossils to the synchrotron particle accelerator in Grenoble, France, to get images, super high resolution images of it, which I'm actually working on those. We're frantically putting them together, so we're thinking a lot about next. We don't really know if they had a cervical lordosis. It's also hard to tell from the bones, inconveniently enough, about that. But that's the key question right now in Australopithecus is, was the neck posture just like ours, or were they, like my new and improved Lucy, I gave her a neck, but we really don't know. I kind of made that bit up, that's why I didn't make a big deal out of it. But that's a big question. And there's kind of Nunu has some neck vertebrae also, which are sort of like apes, and that's like in process, serious in process work that's going on. That's a great question.
Any other questions?
Oh, there's some
Oh,
other-
Richard, yeah.
Does any of the work that you're currently engaged in lead to speculation or inferences about diet? Because you did mention a big gut, and that got me interested.
Yes.
As I came here thinking you might shed some light on current thinking about diet.
Sure. Oh, I can bend your ear later about diet. I've worked on a lot of that stuff too. Anyway, but the torso story does have a relation to diet. There's a hypothesis that, and this came from a lot from that reconstruction of Lucy with that big crazy chimp-like rib cage that was done in the early 80s, that the gut of Australopithecus would have been very large. If you go to the zoo and you see a gorilla, it's got a huge big belly. And that's because it's a very long digestive tract, so it can digest tough plant matter. It takes a long time to process and get the nutrition out of it. So animals that eat a low-quality diet have a very long digestive tracts. And humans, of course, don't. They have a short digestive tract. And so the idea is that somehow between Australopithecus, which would have had this big digestive tract because we can see what the body shape is like, that would have had to change dramatically and reduce the origin of Homo. And that's the same time in the origin of our genus Homo, that brains begin to expand. So it came to the idea that brains are really metabolically expensive. Over a quarter of your calories go to just running your brain, and a baby, 80% of its calories go to just running the brain. It's really metabolically expensive, so it's a costly organ to keep around if you don't eat it. So the idea was, essentially Homo paid for their large brains by getting rid of the gut, which would then use less metabolic energy, and expended that on the brain, which is then under selection for some other reason. And so it's called the expensive tissue hypothesis. But I think if Lucy didn't really have that big gut, if that ribcage reconstruction was inaccurate, I don't think that we can infer a huge gut size in Australopithecus. That said, we know that Australopithecus also had larger teeth and stronger jaws, probably for eating lower quality food, or at least chewing up harder to chew foods, maybe at least in times of scarcity at least. Probably not all the time if they didn't have to, but in times of scarcity. So there probably was some sort of lower quality diet in Australopithecus. But that extreme shift in the expensive tissue, I think this at least makes us think we should question that somewhat. There may have been less of an extreme difference than we thought in terms of gut size anyway. And I could talk about teeth later, but not let me do that right here. These people will never let me go on that one. Yeah.
Presumably the enlarging of the pelvis increased because of the size of our cranium.
Yes.
Or is that too recent to have been a big influence on the pelvis?
When we look at the birth canal size in Lucy, for example, Rudopithecus unfortunately isn't preserved across the midline, so we can't really say a whole lot about that. But in humans, of course, we have really, really big babies, and we have a tough time getting them through the birth canal. And with the origins of larger brains, and we get to the genus Homo, we do see a change in the size of the birth canal. So the overall pelvis, hip to hip, the bone-to-bone width doesn't change too much, but the birth canal inside does, especially in females. But in Lucy, their brains weren't very big yet. They're sort of chimpanzee-sized brains, about like a good-sized orange. And the pelvis was not as enlarged yet because we didn't have this big brain. So there definitely are changes in pelvic morphology associated with increasing brain size. That comes a little bit later.
I thought I saw your hand. Sorry, go. Sorry. Okay.
One up in the back.
I was just wondering, along the same lines as the cervical, have you looked at any correlations with knees and weight bearing in terms of those different pelvis shapes?
Oh, yeah, so what's the question with knees and weight bearing in terms of pelvis shapes? Certainly humans and all the Australopithecines, we're knock-kneed. And so our hips are out to the side, but our knees are right underneath us. So we can take 1 foot off the ground, which is called a carrying angle. And our angles are a pretty high angle. And that lets us keep our foot underneath the center of gravity when we're walking. Otherwise, we have to shift your weight from side to side. Watch a chimpanzee walking. They walk like this because they don't have a carrying angle. Their thigh bones or femurs are straight up and down. Ours are knock-kneed. Australopithecus are knock-kneed as well. Mice and apes are not. So they're not walking bipedally, definitely. And the Australopithecus even was more knock-kneed because they were shorter, so they had relatively wider pelvises for their leg length, and so they're even more knock-kneed. But we don't see that until the hominins.
Any other questions? You're all waiting for the bar, I can tell. Well, I just want to conclude first, well, before thanking Carol, I want to conclude by saying that this presentation, this talk, is going to be available on YouTube. We're not sure when it's going to be posted, but it will be available through the Anthropology Department website. Maybe about a week from now, maybe a little bit earlier, but there'll be announcements on our website, so if you want to see it again, especially if there are journalists here who want to review it before asking Carol questions. So why not, you can, Carol's email address will be available on the website. My email address is available as well. Also tomorrow, Carol is going to be filming a segment for Discovery Planet, which I'm not sure if it's going to be on Friday, the same day, or maybe the following week, but look for that. And you'll get to see Carol talking about this kind of stuff, but also in our lab, in our fossil cast lab in our department, and you'll get to see, if those of you who've never seen it, what that looks like. So I want to thank Carol for an amazing, incredibly informative, and very fascinating lecture. So let's all give her.
Thank you, guys.